Hey everybody, we're Team Dragon. I'm Jay.
I'm Faison Williams.
My name is Janisha Adhikari.
I'm Chaeyoung Zhao.
The tasks for assignment 5 were to continue working on system modeling for the remainder of the system, to work on implementation and take advantage of design patterns and the architecture that we decided upon in assignment 4, to write the tests for the remainder of the system, and also to get the system hosted or deployed. My tasks for this assignment were to work on the implementation using the architecture and design patterns, and to work using a test-driven development approach to implementation, and then to also get the system hosted. Some of the things that I learned are listed as follows. So when working on the implementation, I actually used a lot of various design patterns to build out the system. So things like the singleton pattern, things like bridge pattern, observer pattern, strategy, factory pattern, those kinds of things. And to go into a little bit more detail, so Spring's main benefit is that it not only provides a web server, but also provides really powerful dependency injection, where various components in the system can be wired together using the class definitions that are created by developers and made available using various annotations. For instance, component, service, repository, these kinds of things. And what this means is that a developer can create, let's say, a service that the controller for the application depends on, and then assign the correct annotation to it, which is just the service class annotation. And then inside of the controller for a specific functionality, you would just add a field reference to that component that you want, and then attach an auto-wired annotation to it, which tells Spring that when the application is started, to go ahead and, after constructing the service dependency, like create an instance of it, make it available to the controller that has a dependency on it. So a lot of singletons have been created for the system, singletons for services, controllers, and repositories. I used a lot of bridge patterns for these services, where I would define what the service is, and then using an interface, so list all of the methods that should be available whenever a calling class makes use of an interface. And then I created a separate implementation that adheres to that interface. And so in, for instance, the controller, all of the services implement some interface that's been defined for it. And that's essentially the bridge. So I can use a different service if I want to, service implementation. As long as it implements the correct interface, then it will still work. I also took advantage of the observer pattern for the messaging system in the application. So when a user is using the application, when they are participating in a session, they'll want to know when new users have joined the session, and when users have posted new interaction events, and whenever the session state has been updated by the session leader. And this uses the observer pattern by essentially having the server define the session application state as the observable, which is the data stored in the data layer. And whenever changes are made to it, it updates the state, and the observers receive information about what those changes are automatically through the WebSocket messaging pipeline. The factory pattern was used in various areas within the application to build customized configured objects such as the model mapper or the Jackson JSON, Java object to JSON mapper, where you can define an instance, or you can create an instance of the model mapper and then apply configurations using the build fluent interface, which essentially means that you create an empty instance of the object and then describe the parts that should be integrated with the object and the configurations that should be applied, and then run the build method, and all of those would be wired together to construct a new instance of the model mapper. The learnings that I'll take away from this that will help me in the future is that whenever I'm working with other engineers, because I'm more familiar with design patterns, it'll be a lot easier to communicate more complex ideas with them, because I won't have to go into detail about how the design patterns work or are implemented, or how they stitch into other component patterns, because they'll have an understanding too, as long as they are familiar with design patterns. And so that will allow me to work faster with other engineers and build more complex things. Using TDD will allow me to just build higher quality stuff, because as I'm working, I'll be familiar with creating tests to always verify the functionality that I'm developing, which means that I'll develop higher quality, and my team can trust me to develop different software. The biggest challenge that I faced for this assignment was migrating, or the process of migrating the software that we're developing in a development environment into a hosted environment. Some of the behaviors or configurations that are applied to the development environment do not apply in a hosted environment. So for instance, the front-end client uses push state, which means that routing is handled on the client side, whereas the backend server also has routing of its own using controllers. And so there's a little bit of conflict, especially because of the fact that we are using Spring Security to prevent some routes from being accessed without authentication. And so configuration of what routes people are allowed to access can prevent people from being able to access some of the front-end routes. And so because the front-end client is built and then injected into the backend, and then the backend is built and packaged and deployed to to a hosted client, there may be issues with accessing the front-end views and then propagating captured URLs that don't match backend URLs and sending that to the front end, which is pretty tough challenge.
I worked on our front end design. So as far as what I've learned for this project, just working around communication, and also I learned a lot about debugging and how to work with tech in certain contexts. So like, for example, if I find like a correct answer for how to do something on the official documentation or on Stack Exchange, in our particular context, I might have to alter it in order to fit the project. And also just learned a lot about technologies like React and Bootstrap. As far as how I'll apply it in my future, I'll apply just like working as like a software engineering team, knowing how that process goes, knowing how to learn things a little better. And so as far as the most challenging experience, a lot of it was just like learning how to deal with like not knowing certain CS topics, and how to go about learning that, or how to go about communicating with my team that I don't know something. So
My assignment for this task was to do the front-end design as well as the report for this assignment. The things that I have learned from this assignment is about the Bootstrap, which is the most popular framework for creating layouts. It also includes HTML and CSS based designs, and it has like templates for forms, buttons, tables, navigation, such that things. So since I have knowledge about Bootstrap now, whenever I'll be doing any more web development projects in my future classes or in my jobs, I will be applying the Bootstrap knowledge that I have learned right now. And the most challenging part was to deal with the Bootstrap and how to start with it, implementing it. Since it was my first time, I did not have a lot of knowledge about it. So I researched it about it online, and there were lots of documents as well as videos that helped me run my problems through it. And then, yeah, I learned a lot of things about from them.
My task for this assignment is create a feedback and a session models and the repositories based on the updated class diagram, and create a controller for the feedback part as well. What I learned from this assignment is I learned update and pull requests to GitHub and cooperate online, and as well as the use Docker in my desktop. How will I apply what I've learned in the future? This is the first project to use the Spring Framework in Java for me, and it's pretty helpful for me to generate overall views of the future project, and the break down the entire project to several small teamwork and progress, communicate with the code with team member using GitHub pull requests feels pretty good. The most challenging part is the code part is not very easy because I'm new to Spring Framework, and the notifications, the notations and the relation between the different directories need to take care with, and I need to reference a lot of documents with the Spring Framework. That's it.
We're Team Dragon.